There we are. Good morning, everybody. So if you were with us at KubeCon in Chicago, you probably saw a whole bunch of links like this plastered all over everyone's presentations, as well as in the booth for Istio. We had like a physical QR code there for folks to scan. The point was to steer as many users as possible to an end user survey. It was put together by Lynn's son and maybe a few others. I don't know who all was involved in it. I wasn't involved in it in putting the survey together, but we got pretty good responses and a decent amount of traffic on the survey over the course of the conference. And this is just the readout on the data that what we've learned. So our response rate over that traffic curve was 38%. So 38% of users who scanned the QR code also filled out the survey, which is actually really, I think it's a really good number. Looking at the deployment topology of those who took the survey, we want to understand kind of, are we hearing from significant users of Istio, people who are evaluating the product? Not that the evaluation feedback would not be significant or important to us, but that we would take different sorts of action based on the different types of users that might be providing feedback. So, most of the survey results, like over 2/3, were running Istio in production. And the remainder seemed to be evaluating or waiting for something. This was a plain text field, so there's quite a bit of variety down here at the trailing edge. But at a high level, we're looking at mostly users who are running Istio in production. We asked them how many clusters they're running to get an idea of deployment size. Only one respondent had a single cluster. The rest of them were running in multiple clusters, with some of them running more than 20, almost a third of them running more than 20. So some significant deployments going here. If we look at the number of nodes in the cluster, we see a little bit more variety, a bit more spread out. Again, interestingly, 1 to 20 nodes now makes up 1/6 of our respondents, or about 8 responses, which ordinarily you would expect 1 to 20 nodes to be a part of a single cluster. So it sounds like there are some very small clusters out there being leveraged, and that's quite all right, but this gives us an idea of cluster size as well. If we sort of map this back to the number of clusters running, we get an idea that there's actually a lot of variety in cluster size. Some companies are running a single cluster with many, many nodes. Others are going to be running many clusters with few nodes and everything in between. This was an interesting one. We asked them what Kubernetes providers they were using, from the managed providers, GKE, EKS, AKS, to K3S or Keys, however that's pronounced, as well as a few other. I think Canonical produces a distro, etc. And while the data on which providers they were using wasn't the most interesting, the data on how many providers I found really fascinating. This sort of looks at the multi-cloud story. So for the most common response was, of course, between 100 and 500 nodes across a single Kubernetes provider. And I saw a comment come through and I didn't.
Sorry, it wasn't a useful comment.
Okay,
Carry on.
No worries. Most folks are using only a single provider, but there's still a decent number of customers who are leveraging multiple providers. This one customer indicated 4 different Kubernetes providers across only 1 to 20 nodes. So again, some variety of experience there, but by and large, we're seeing a heavy emphasis in a single provider and sort of at that 100 to 500 node sweet spot. Any questions on this page? All right, we'll keep moving. Looking at what features our customers care about. Oh, and I forgot to change this text. We're trying to understand what differentiates users and where our features are at in sort of the maturity cycle for adoption. We asked our users what the most useful feature was. I would have, for my money, I would have said we're going to hear MTLS or observability at the top, hands down, and I would have been wrong. Traffic control came out on top. And that's something that we should consider going forward. Traffic control is not the same as traffic resiliency, which only had one respondent indicate that resiliency was the most useful feature on Istio. So this is going to be things like load balancing controls, routing traffic based on path or headers, etc. Any questions here? Okay, we'll move along. We asked the users of all features you just saw on the previous page, where were they using each of them? In production, in evaluation, or not at all? I've not graphed the not at all because it didn't seem to add a lot of value to the chart, but it's not a surprise that many users are making use of Istio ingress. That's often a starting point for Istio adoption before even doing sidecar injection. You can adopt Istio ingress, followed by MTLS and observability. This graph looks a little bit more like I would have expected it to in terms of feature adoption, what's made it into production for most of our use cases. Things that are at the bottom are not terribly surprising either. VMs are low interest and low adoption. WASM is low adoption but high interest. So this might give us an idea of how to prioritize the maturity of these features as we move forward. Might make sense to invest more in WASM than we do in VMs for Istio. Questions here? All right, we'll move along. We gave a plain text answer for or question, what features do you want to add? And it's not surprising that ambient ranks pretty high in the features that users are looking for. I didn't pull out individual quotes, didn't find any that were particular. Federation also rated relatively high. And then, of course, some of these words are not particularly informative in a word cloud. Istio, Envoy, Mesh, Traffic. There were a number of requests for integrations with other technologies. And there were a variety of technologies asked to be integrated with. Some of them are vendor specific. So we would need to sort of consider how we want to proceed there. We also asked users about how often they intend to upgrade and how often they are upgrading. The most interesting data here is the version that the user was running in production or in their environment. Sorry, this is not guaranteed to be a production environment. So we've got many users running these 119 and 118, which were the two supported versions at the time that the survey went out. 117 had just fallen out of support perhaps 4 weeks prior to KubeCon, but it didn't have any vulnerabilities yet. There had not been any CVEs that had not been, or that had been announced but not released to the 117 branch. So these folks would have been out of support, not vulnerable, maybe needing to upgrade quickly when the next vulnerability wears out if they're particularly security conscious. Then a full 39.6% were running 116, 115, 114, and I didn't draw the arrow down here to 113, but those versions all had known unpatched serious CVEs affecting them. So it's not necessarily clear. We didn't ask users whether they thought their deployments were vulnerable. That would have been an interesting tidbit to gather here to get an idea on whether they're aware of the vulnerabilities. But 39.6% incidentally is much better than the data we were gathering at Google while I was still there regarding vulnerability in Istio versions running in production. Now, granted, the data we were gathering at Google was not self-reported. You can find it in sort of the history of the TOC. We've had a number of upgrade report outs through the years. That was actually usage-based. So it's possible that users are simply not aware of what versions they're actually running, and they have a great deal more vulnerable versions than they're aware of. Or it's possible that this has just really improved over the last year and a half, which would be pretty cool. Questions there? All right, we will move forward. We asked them how often they intend to upgrade Istio, and we got a lot of long answers which don't fit in the pie chart terribly well. The most common answer here being periodically or when I need a feature. When there's a particular feature these users are looking for that has been added to a minor version, they will go ahead and upgrade. And then also when their current version stops receiving updates, a number of users will upgrade then, but there's not a strong leader here. There's a lot of variety and extraordinarily long tail in the answers. Like, I don't know what to make of evaluating as an answer to this question. I think I understand n minus 1. There was one of the answers in this long tail that doesn't show up on the first page of text here was when I have time, showing that Istio users still struggle to have to carve out the time to keep Istio up to date. They're still feeling at least that tension. There's a sentiment that they ought to be upgrading more often than they are, but it is difficult for platform engineering teams to carve that time out. And then the last slide doesn't really fit the theme of this section, but thought I would throw in. We asked our users what's blocking them. Ambient mesh and ambient mesh documentation in particular popped up to the top of the list pretty quickly. I think what we take away here is that we've had ambient announced now for, well, at the time of the survey, about 15 months. And it was not at that time in beta. And there's a lot of users who have decided to wait in terms of Istio adoption, and they're holding their breath, so to speak, for ambient to be ready for production. So I think this does put some extra pressure on us, given the amount of time we've been, announced and then in alpha, to make sure that we are delivering ambient in a production-ready format in the near future, because I think we're seeing that existing Istio adoption is effectively paused in a lot of cases, waiting for this. And the longer we keep that pause, the more that we lose faith, first of all. And second of all, the more that we lose adoption. Those who would be onboarding to Istio are holding off, and that's not great for our project as a whole or for those users. So that's all of my TED Talk. So if there's questions, happy to chat, or I'm happy to pass on to the next item in the agenda.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mitch, for sharing this. Really appreciate it. Honestly, some of the credit goes to the Cilium project. I actually steal most of the questions, or a good chunk of the question from their survey, because I thought it was really good questions. And then one only point I want to make is on the slide, what's blocking you? We all see ambient is like the biggest and boldest. In fact, the data is actually biased because the data was joined from users already Istio, right? Most of the users already Istio users, or user being seriously looking Istio is actually not the users we're targeting for ambient. So if we were survey like the broader, even broader ecosystem, I'd imagine, ambient could be even stronger.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it also raises a question of, I'm not sure that we've clearly communicated to our users who ambient is going to be for. In that we have, these are, as we saw, 67% of them are running Istio in production, which means they're running in sidecar mode or they're running an alpha of ambient in production. Either way, their sentiment is that they are waiting or blocked on ambient adoption. It might be good to have some communication in the near future that explains, like, hey, ambient is beta at L4 in, what is it, 121, 122, whatever May's release is. But really what this is designed for, the user we're targeting, is not necessarily the existing Istio user. That's why we haven't developed a migration case. Obviously, L7 isn't quite ready, going to be quite ready for prime time at that point. So that's a great point, Lynn. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Eric, you good?
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, so this is sort of related to a question that a developer had asked me a while back. And I said I'd bring up in TOC because I really didn't know what the answer was. And I guess there's could be a secondary question here too. But basically their comment was, or their question was, they had created a PR and had, gotten it merged, and it was either a blog or doc PR, and they had created some images, and they wanted to reuse those within a company blog that they were working on. And their comment was, "Well, can I do that?" And I said, "Well, that's a good question." And I don't know what the real answer is. I mean, we do have a license out there, but how does that pertain to images? I know we've seen people use images, in other things like, presentations at conferences and stuff. So I didn't think it was a big deal, but I thought I would just ask here and see if anybody had any additional thoughts.
So Eric, this is probably more a question for steering, right? Because it pertains to copyright.
Yeah.
But there are guidelines, right? Certainly the copyright guidelines for the usage of the Istio logo and Istio trademarks are pretty well established. And I suspect that if whatever anybody's doing is aligned with those, that it's probably fine.
Justin, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I'm definitely not a lawyer, but I thought, I mean, unless something happens when it gets transferred over, I would think that they would continue to own the copyright on their own stuff.
Yeah, that's sort of what I thought. But again, I'm not a lawyer either, so.
I don't think we assert copyright over anything other than what was donated to the CNCF. Or Mark. Keith.
Right. Keith?
So I think the core of the question or the problem is the fact that when you create a PR with an image inside of a repo, does essentially putting an image inside of a repo signify a transfer of ownership of the work in question, meaning the image? I don't think that that's the case, especially given the very permissive licensing of the Istio project. And if any sort of dispute were to break out, things like file timestamps, like the person creating it, unless they're explicitly saying, "I am now giving this to the Istio project for, under these terms," a simple PR, putting it on the website does not signify a transfer of ownership of the work itself. So it should be again, I'm also not a lawyer, but it should be pretty much a nothing burger from my understanding. But the fact that we're talking about this means that we should probably document that somewhere, even if it's in fine print.
All right, Lynn?
Hey, I just want to ask, do you know what image they are? Is it some architecture diagram, or because the logo, I assume it's okay to use. But for the diagram, I think at the minimum they should mention where they source it.
Right. I mean, they could certainly mention that. And I don't recall which images it was. At least in this particular individual, I could probably go back and look at their PRs and figure out what the image was. But I don't recall specifically. But I recall they mentioned blog when I wrote this up. So it would have been an image that they put in one of their blogs.
Yeah, can you provide a little bit more detail and then maybe we can discuss on Istio steering on Thursday too. Just making
Okay.
sure we have documentation around this, like Keith was mentioning.
Okay, I can do that. Anybody have anything else? Otherwise, we can go to John.
What do I have again? Yes. So this has come up a lot, and it's very broad, but it's kind of like, what should we do about sidecars in ambient? This happens in a lot of our discussions where people will say things like, we shouldn't do this in sidecars and we should just do an ambient because sidecars are dead, or there's kind of different opinions on what sidecars look like in the future, and it's impacting your ability to make decisions in the project. So it seems like we should come up with some strategy here. And I think it's perfectly fine if the strategy is let's ship ambient and wait and see. But we probably should also have, a short-term strategy for how we should address designs and whatnot in the meantime.
What sort of treatment did you have in mind?
The thing that comes to mind for me is that it's way too early to say long-term that we should only invest in ambient, in my opinion. That would be a bad idea in my mind. That might be something in a year or two from now, we say, if things become wildly successful. But then we do need something in the meantime. I don't think it necessarily needs to be that like every feature needs to be in sidecar and must have total parity between the two, but it also shouldn't be that sidecars are top liver and we don't care about them anymore. Somewhere in between. Not sure exactly where we should go in between on that though. So
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we've talked through as a group, like what are the architectural options for the evolution of sidecar going forward, right? And so at some point we should probably do that, right? I mean, there's Z-tunnel as a sidecar, there's sandwiched envoy, right? There's quite a long list of things which have ramifications for the maintenance and evolution of sidecar. And so it depends a lot about what, like looking at that user survey, what features are users trying to get out of it? Like the hot topic has always been, for a zero trust purist, right? Do you have to do MTLS in the same application container? Right? Is that the reason why you care about sidecar? If you don't care about that, you might, and you care more about traffic control, then a sandwich sidecar might be totally fine, for instance. And that would yield maintainability benefits, as we well know, right? Because it would radically simplify the configuration of the sidecar. I think the short answer is we simply don't know, right? And until ambient has had bake time and we get more feedback about the shortcomings of ambient and whether those shortcomings can be met by sidecar, I just don't know how we assess it.
So I've got a bit of a follow-up question. Well, maybe it's not a follow-up question. Maybe it's more of a bit of a pushback. When I look at the users of Istio in production today, like the survey Mitch just presented shows we have a vast number of percentage of our users using Istio in production. I don't know how sidecars ever go away on a short to medium time horizon. To me, that just feels like a mathematical fact. Looking at the hesitancy to upgrade on the other slide, where people only tend to upgrade or change things when they want to add a new feature, and taking into account what probably most of us on this call understand about infrastructure, that's not where a lot of users are wanting to spend their time. And so, yes, ambient has a lot of benefits, and we certainly want users to take advantage of those benefits. Some people here are wanting to create products around those benefits, and that's all well, good, and appropriate. But it's sort of what John was alluding to, the idea that sidecars are essentially a second-class citizen in Istio feels incompatible with the adoption and production usage of the projects that we're seeing, that the data is showing us. And so maybe I think maybe that's a place to have the conversation. I think it's definitely not, we're going to be doing evaluation and be continuing to get new data, but as long as the numbers look like they do and look that they have, I don't see how we get around that reality. And if we agree on that, like if the data keeps saying that, then I think that maybe there's more we can do as a project to maybe calm the fears of sidecar users, because that was one of the other things during the live stream, is that people wanted to know that sidecars weren't going to go away. We're going to still receive care. We kind of had those questions. And also, as far as decision making goes, if all community members can understand that sidecars are going to be around for a while and maintained for a while, then I think that will help us productivity wise. Okay, soapbox done. I'm done.
Okay, I think I might be next. So I don't think anybody is saying sidecar is going away or anything, or even sidecar is second citizen, right? I think we as a project did the right decision when we try to launch Ambient in the next few months. When we claim beta, we don't claim support for sidecar, right? Because I think that's important as far as targeting the desired user of Ambient, which is not the existing user of the sidecar today. But to your point, Keith, I don't think we have any intention to claim, sidecar is going away or anything, because we're really trying to target Ambient to the users we couldn't reach through sidecars. And honestly, I don't think existing users of sidecar would move to Ambient in day one or in the first year or so unless they see huge success from users using Ambient.
Yeah, I would agree. I think though that some of our actions, or at least the conversations, like if you were just listening to the conversations, then it would feel like it's all ambient all the time, and that's the direction that it's going. I think one thing that I don't think we've discussed much that probably would be good to cover is what the interop story is with ambient and with sidecars, because I don't think it's a topic we've really figured much out about how to make that work, what that looks like.
Yeah, in addition to interop, I think maybe, Lynn, you're right that among the TOC, I don't think it's ever been the plan for us to, abandon ambient or anything, or abandon sidecars or anything along those lines. However, we've not made an official statement. We don't have a decision that we can point to and says, no, we're definitely going this direction. And so, as John's mentioned in the chat, if you look back over our community meetings for the last year, or you look into design docs, it is regularly stated, not by TOC members, that sidecars are not the future of Istio and we really don't need to worry about sidecars. And that would worry me as a user. I think it might be worthwhile for us to be able to put a decision on the record today about under what circumstances we would be willing to abandon sidecars, or just saying we simply aren't, and we would need to revisit that at a later time. That way, when those things come up in the community meetings in smaller places where not all of the TOC are present, we can point back to a record of that decision and say, no, we're not doing that. That's absolutely not what the project is doing. Rather, we're going to continue support.
Just to be clear, I thought when we announced Ambient, we did actually make a public statement about this in the blogs, Mitch.
We did. I think maybe towards the end, I think there is a section about what about sidecars, but I agree, it may not be super clear to people.
Right. So while I agree in principle, Mitch, it's a little hard to kind of hypothesize exactly the circumstances under which we would nominally deprecate sidecars, right? Like you could say, like, okay, 80% of new users use ambient, or 95% of new users adopt ambient, which is effectively 100% because you can't really measure the difference of 5%. No, that might be a leading indicator that a year from that point, maybe you should go and officially deprecate and provide deprecation timeline guidance. But doing that without having qualitative understanding about why users are doing that, it would be really hard.
I would think something more along the lines of a statement of, we will not consider deprecating sidecars unless we see something significant, and we can define something significant. It's not an automatic trigger. I'm not meaning to like design the deprecation years out, simply trying to give some degree of reassurance that that is not on the horizon to our users.
Do we even need to be that specific though? Could we just say like we have no plans to abandon sidecars, and we, you know, like I don't know if we need to even list what the circumstances are. Like I think that might be just more too specific. Like I think we just say, you know, this is our plan. We're continuing to support sidecars. We don't see you know, an end point of that. And then, you know, later on, years down the line, if we see a reason, then we can start discussing it. But we haven't backed ourselves into a corner either by saying we will always support sidecars forever.
I like that.
I think even more so than support, maybe something a little stronger might be in order, and say like sidecars will still receive new features, because I've heard that be under conversation where, you know,
yeah. So support, I meant support as in we continue to develop it, but you're right, that was a little bit squishy of a term.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think as long as we can, like sidecars will continue as normal. I'm not saying I have to say this, but the general idea, in my understanding from TOC, is that TOC is saying that sidecar development will continue as normal as there is bandwidth amongst community members to do it. There will just be some, I don't know. I don't know if there's ever going to be a case. Well, I don't want to say anything too specific because I think that's TOC's job. But maybe that's a good like discriminator. Like, do we foresee there being a case where we say we're not going to put that in sidecar because we're going to put it in ambient? Do we see that being the sort of decision that we make in the community? Yeah, I'll leave that question there.
I think that decision is largely around the ambient architecture. There are things that you can do with the ambient architecture that you cannot do with the sidecar architecture very easily, such as fine-tuning your Envoy resource utilization to each individual application. We're probably not going to roll out comprehensive new features for that in sidecar mode, or achieve parity with what you can achieve in ambient, but that's inherent to the architecture. I don't see a future for us where we say, well, WASM works fine on either case, but for whatever reason, we're only putting it into beta and ambient. I can't imagine making that sort of a decision at this point.
Right, and we should also just like have the intellectual honesty to notice that we are cost conscious, right? Like there is not unlimited developer bandwidth. If there is some complicated feature that could theoretically exist in both stacks, and 80 to 90% of the users were on one stack, whatever that was, the economics would almost certainly cause that feature to be delivered first for the most used stack. Right? I think that's just the normal way software is going to end up working. We just don't know. Right? The one thing we have to be very careful of, right, is kind of getting trapped in one of those states, right, where we don't have the engineering bandwidth to implement every feature in both stack. We have an 80-20 split, let's say, between the two stacks. And we're going to have to make some hard decisions about how to prioritize work. That's the job of the TOC, right? So we just accept that as our responsibility, that we will have to make pragmatic, cost-oriented decisions at some point with regards to this, depending on the outcome. But we don't know the outcome. So
I think that's the tension, Louis. I think is that there's a difference between where we want ambient to be and where ambient currently is with respect to adoption, and how that's going to, and how does that play into the economics of resourcing today. So even though we might want one day for ambient to be at the 80%, right now, I think if we're honest, mostly because ambient's not at
it's
beta
zero.
yet, it's at zero. So I think those principles coming from TOC will be really helpful. I'm glad we're having this meeting and that's recorded, because that's something I think that when we're discussing designs for things or features and such, like that's part of the calculus that we can that community members can point to make informed decisions based on the most impact to the most number of users. And when that data
Right.
changes, we can reevaluate.
Right, and like we've obviously tilted the scale deliberately in terms of engineering investment towards ambient to allow ambient to come to parity with sidecar in terms of production stability and supportability, right? Deliberately.
Cool. I agree. We should probably get this typed up as notes on this, and then we can just say that everyone in TOC is in agreement to the note. Sounds like we're on the same page. We just need to write it up so that we don't have to send someone to a YouTube video and trying to deduce it themselves.
I mean, if I were to summarize, my position is sidecars will be supported until the community tells us not to, right? For some rough definition of what the community tells us is, right? Whether it's a user survey, a flood of emails, I don't know, but it's roughly that.
I'd also suggest during the KubeCon talks that maybe that get referenced also when there's like the status of the project, just reiterate that for whoever's giving that talk.
Okay, so we probably should discuss quickly who's giving that talk. Eric, did your travel approval got declined also?
Well, let's just say it didn't get declined, but there isn't enough money, and I was paying a lot of my own. So I decided not to go. So my plan right now is for Mitch to replace me on that panel.
Mitchell was already in the panel, am I right?
No, not this Day panel. This is the maintainer track.
Oh, the maintainer track, okay.
Yeah, so basically, from my perspective, right, I needed to find somebody to replace me in the maintainer track. And then, yes, I won't be on the panel, but that should be, one person less. But I think the discussion point here is probably the maintainer track discussion, right? So make sure that Mitch and Hangzhou, I think, discuss that.
Yeah, that is the discussion. So for the panel, we just have one less person, which is totally fine. We still have 4 people. So for the maintainer, I didn't know Mitch was already signed up for it. I thought about some of our new maintainers like Ben, if we want a fresh face, but I'm happy with whatever you guys decide.
Well, Mitch was the only one who responded to my email. And no, I didn't send it out very wide, but I didn't get any other recommendations either. But I mean,
That's
if we want to
cool.
switch
Yeah.
it to Ben, that's fine too.
That's cool. I mean, we can rotate next time.
Okay, should we move on?
Yep.
John, do you want to do this time?
Sure. Should we share this? Are you going to share it too, or
I can, but you can take over.
All right, I'm taking over, but I think I have too many docs open. It's loading pretty slowly. Wow, very slow.
Let me know if you want to switch.
I think it should be going now. There we go. All right,
There you go.
cool. I wasn't actually in the last Ambit meeting, so I don't know what was covered and where we should skip to. Maybe you could point me to where we should pick up, since I don't think it's at the beginning, right?
I gave an update about the kind of structural separation within the doc between redirection, binding, and generation. Kind of pointing out that redirection versus binding and generation could probably be split into two different docs.
Yeah.
That not all the binding implementations will be done up front, but some will, some of the more obvious ones. And generation is likely to evolve in conjunction with binding to match. And there's still some open things to cover in those areas, but certainly at a high level, redirection is mostly stable except for one question that you and I think have to resolve on. Binding and generation can evolve, right? They're not, in particular, like redirection plus the stock Istio waypoint, the built-in one, right, can continue, right, without much impediment based on binding and generation, which are almost like a separate, not quite separate, but separable in terms of work streams. And that there were also work items brought up in GitHub that Ian created, and then I added some stuff too. So work was underway, I guess, was the other point I made.
Yeah. I think one thing that would probably be useful from my perspective, I mean, I directionally agree with all of this. It sounds like, from my understanding, most people are at least in the same direction. But it's also very high level and vague, and like, here's 5 different ways we could do this, and maybe we'll support all 5 in the long term for maximum compatibility, but realistically, we're going to support 1 or 2 in the short term. So having a kind of concrete action plan of what we're going to do, especially like what we're going to do for beta or like in the next few months with, you know, some urgent timelines, would probably be helpful. The only thing I'm a little bit worried about is we all say, hey, this is approved, and then we go see someone implement like one of the really obscure forward-looking things, and it's like, this is probably not what we should be doing right now. So I don't want to set the wrong expectations for people actually turning this into reality. Which could probably be either those GitHub issues or maybe just a tactical design doc that's 1 or 2 pages of here's exactly what things we need to change and where and whatnot.
We can actually look at the GitHub issue. I tried to provide a decent amount of detail about kind of, well, what I thought high, medium, and low priorities might be. Let's see. Aligned a little bit with what I was saying earlier, right? So the first priority, right, is to get the working system, right? So stock Istio waypoint plus functioning redirection, right? Irrespective of what the binding and generation specs actually are, right? So we can do end-to-end testing. Seems like it would be the right priority. Then in terms of binding and generation, the next most obvious thing would be the degenerate simple HTTP case, right? Because it's entirely covered by the Gateway API specification. And so figuring out a way to bind to that, just manually authored, would be my next choice in terms of priority, because that would show the pluggability capability. And then those 2 tracks kind of evolve in parallel, and the generation one could go along with the binding one as that evolved. But I suspect there will be many iterations of binding and generation, right? At least.
Yeah.
So that was how I tried to structure the work items in the GitHub issue. I generally think this
this makes sense. The one thing that I still think is somewhat open is what is, if a user just does Istio install, which option are we doing for them? Like, are they doing native HBone? Are they doing sandwich with proxy?
Oh, so what for the stock Istio waypoint?
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah, and I think I had an item to resolve that decision point. Let's see, where is it? Validate sandwich versus inline HBone for Istio waypoint.
Okay, so we're still waiting on the performance attributes of that to make a decision, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was the one that I saw was the one blocking for delivering the stock one. Making that decision, one way or the other. There's obviously, I think there's general consensus, and people correct me if I'm wrong, that if we could meet the performance requirements with sandwiched, we would prefer to. For not just the simplicity of the waypoint itself, but also as validation that the composability properties of the system are going to work for other use cases, right? Sandwiched non-stock waypoints, sandwiched sidecars, theoretically, Z-tunnel sandwiched applications where no waypoint or sidecar is being used, all would benefit from the performance of that stack being pretty good. And it's not a requirement, right? Obviously, the waypoint can natively do HBone and not be sandwiched, but the other use cases wouldn't be met by work done to meet the performance requirements following that pattern. Anyway, so that's my impression, but if people are welcome to differ.
I mostly agree. I mean, I guess if the performance is the same, then it's fine. I do worry a bit about perceived complexity of having the sandwich. Like if we talk about like what's the network path of a packet going from point A to point B, and it's like, well, it goes through the Z tunnel, then the other Z tunnel, and the waypoint Z tunnel, Z tunnel. It's a lot of hops, a lot that can go wrong, a lot to debug. It's probably fine, but something we should be conscious of. Even if it meets the performance, it may actually be perceived as slower. It may actually be slower. But I do agree that it's useful to optimize that case because that's exactly what applications are doing. So it is a very good validation. Yeah, I mean, if we see the numbers, I think it's really what we need to make a decision. Do we expect those to be ready in the coming weeks or? Well, I guess what are we targeting? This kind of going off topic. What are we targeting for 122? And is it implementing? Like, do we want the full implementation of this doc by 122? Because that may change some of our decisions, right? If we're waiting for, long-term measurements, we may make a short-term decision and then reevaluate as needed if, they show different data or et cetera.
Pragmatically speaking, on the performance side, if sandwiched sandwiched waypoint was within some reasonable bound of unsandwiched waypoint from a performance standpoint, we'd have a difficult decision to make.
Yeah.
A good difficult decision to make, right? About whether to make some assumption, right? If it was within 5%, I would 100% say we should do sandwiched.
Yeah.
If it was within 20%, I'd still probably lean towards sandwich, but it would be a much harder decision. If it was twice as slow, right, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, the other consideration for me is if we do want 122, Envoy and like all the data plane aspects, Envoy and Z-tunnel already have full support for doing native HBone. So it's much quicker to implement that. The control plane work, sure, we'll need a little bit of work, but we already mostly have it. So we could implement the native HBone faster as like a first draft of this doc and then switch it for sandwich as the data and the implementations come in. Would that make sense?
That's like we compare them. We have to have both anyway. So
yeah. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. So there's that. I think the other. So you asked what else would we like to ship? I'd like to ship at least some pluggable form of the binding. At least, I don't know if at beta, but I'm not entirely sure why we couldn't ship it at beta. The only question I would have was whether we would ship it sandwiched or unsandwiched. Right, we have to choose between one of those two things because they just represent different forms of complexity. My preference would be to ship a sandwiched one, but I'm open to options on that front. I'm not excluding the other one. It's just I think it would be generally more useful and easier for others to validate that they could be sandwiched or
Yeah.
be pluggable if they were also sandwiched.
We're talking about the dummy sandwich.
Dummy.
Like
Which
it's just Nginx. It's just doing HTTP.
Yeah, the
Okay.
simple
So
the
in
simple
that case-
HTTP binding.
If I may be wrong, but I think sandwich first, not sandwich there is already done. It's already implemented basically because it's just a normal workload, right?
Yeah, that's why I think it's probably the first one that we.
Yeah, like I don't even know if there's any implementation for that. Actually, there might be if we treat waypoints as special. We just need to not treat them specially. So if it is, it's probably like a one-liner. So I agree with you basically. We should do that. But we also almost can't not ship the unsandwiched one because it's just a matter of if they annotate it with the redirection or not, right?
Yeah, quite. It might be very easy to do both. In which case, and if it's easy and it's stable, then we should ship it at beta. The pluggability part, not the actual waypoint themselves.
And just to make sure I'm understanding the conversation here, all of this document is around waypoint L7. So none of this blocks L4 going to beta at 122. This is just what would we like to have at L7 for 122.
Just waypoints or not. Don't make the separation between L4 and L7.
Okay,
Waypoints can do L4.
right.
Yeah, I know. So it's yeah.
So I guess I'll rephrase it then. None of this blocks Z tunnel from going to beta in 120.
Yes.
Great.
Well, there are some
Yeah.
slight tweaks on the capture, but I guess never mind. That's you only need the service capture if you add the waypoints. So there's work to be done as part of this in Z tunnel, but it's not necessary for a Z tunnel exclusive mesh.
Thank you.
Right. So yeah, WGS might need a little bit of work. I have to review that. Z tunnel probably needs a little bit of work, but not a little, which is nice. The control plane needs a fair bit of work. Anyway, take a look at the GitHub work breakdown. People are going to start working on this ASAP, right? I think. And quite a few people have signed up to take on pieces of work. So the only other remaining, the Alt-Z stuff has to be approved. And we need to get the telemetry stuff done. Justin, you weren't in the meeting last week, Wednesday, but there's some elevated urgency now about getting a telemetry or some definition of what telemetry could be brought to beta. Given that hopefully this document is now roughly in an implementable state, which is why it's being put up for sign off. I volunteered some of my time to take up the telemetry stuff starting this week or later this week.
Okay. Yeah, Lay was finishing up a project and he said he needed a couple of weeks. That couple of weeks is up. So if we want to pull him in, I think he should be available. I'll follow up with him today about that.
Okay, I'll sync up with you on Slack. Okay.
Great.
Anyway, I guess we're looking for approval. Even in a somewhat not completely completed state, there's still a couple of open issues, which is why I said, people are welcome to signal approval for direction, and we'll just make sure to keep the document up to date.
Awesome. Thank you.
John, was there anything else you wanted to say about it?
Not really. There was one thing I posted on the chat. I don't know how familiar everyone is with this new library, but there's been some discussion on whether we should rebase the ambient controller on this new Kubernetes controller library that we've been working on. So far, the consensus seems to be yes. So there's a PR to change the existing code over, and then we would depend on that for other future ones, which should make things much simpler. The main risk is that we're going to make ambient beta. We're rewriting the control plane implementation basically entirely. Introduces some risk. So,
What is excellent about this library?
it changes the controller implementation from being imperative, like I got an add event, now go update these 10 indexes and recompute all these other 14 indexes and merge these two, to just being declarative. And it's like, here's how I build a workload object. It needs these services, it needs these nodes, it needs these namespaces, and then it handles everything for you in terms of the events and updates and things like that. So
it eliminates a ton of boilerplate, and in the process tends to eliminate a ton of bugs in sort of the experiments and tests we've run.
Yeah,
By
most
the
of the
way,
work in
this-
building it was fixing the test where the test was actually wrong. And
Nice. Is this for Sidecar also, the new controller, Joe?
I mean, it is a generic library to write controllers, so it could be used for anything. Today, there's only a PR to rewrite the ambient specific controller.
Okay, that was my question. Thank you.
In theory, we could go rewrite all of Istio. That's probably not something we should say we should do yet until we gradually build up experience and more experimental code paths like ambient and whatnot.
Yeah, makes sense to land to ambient first. Yeah. Well, thank you, John and Louis, for driving these design docs to closure. I know there's a lot of effort put in for these, so thank you.
Happy to do it. All right, I think we're at time, everybody. Yeah, if you can take a look at the document and indicate your disposition in the approver section, we appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
will do.
See you all.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye.